I want to ask you an important question that maybe you've never considered before. How much of who you believe you are was actually chosen by you? Now, I want you to sit with that for a moment because I'm not sure most of us have ever really asked ourselves that question. Probably because it makes us extremely uncomfortable to even consider it, much less say it out loud. We spend a lifetime becoming someone. We build careers and businesses. We enter relationships. We become parents and partners and leaders. We develop values and beliefs and definitions of success. We learn what it means to be responsible, to be strong, to be good, to be successful, to be worthy. And somewhere along the way, all of that becomes who we are, or at least who we believe we are. But what if some of it was never yours? Just consider that for a moment. What if some of the identities that we have spent years trying to live up to were handed to us long before we were ever old enough or aware enough or free enough to decide who we actually wanted to be? Because before you had language for who you were, other people already had language for who they wanted you to be. They had hopes for you, expectations of you, fears about you. They had already begun creating ideas about who you would become and what your life should look like through the lens of what they knew, what they had experienced, what they had missed, and sometimes the lack or scarcity they themselves had lived through. And most of the time, I don't believe any of that was done with malice. I think people just gave us what they had. They taught us what they knew. They passed down what had been passed down to them through generations of experience, fear, trauma, survival, love, protection, and all of the things that shape a human life. They passed down beliefs, sometimes simply because those beliefs had been given to them and no one had ever taught them. They were allowed to question whether or not they were true. They passed down fears that may not have even begun with them. They gave us their definitions of success, sometimes through the limited lens of the possibilities they themselves had been exposed to. They taught us responsibility based on what responsibility had meant in their own lives, which may have been much more hard or rigid or heavy or really rooted in survival. They taught us what it meant to be strong based on what they needed strength to mean. They taught us what it meant to be safe, sometimes from the places where they'd never felt safe themselves. They taught us what it meant to be loved and accepted, sometimes while carrying their own longing to experience those very things. Maybe they wanted something better for us. Maybe they were trying to protect us. Maybe they were doing the very best they could with what they had, even when what they had was incomplete. These people can only give from what they know. And sometimes what they know is limited by the ceiling that they have never realized they are living underneath. And as children, as young people, even as adults trying to find our way, we absorb so much of it, not only through what we're told, but through what we experience or what is modeled for us, through what is rewarded, through what creates tension, and through what makes the room feel safe and what we know makes the room feel uncertain. We absorb so much before we ever know we are allowed to question any of it. So maybe you became the responsible one, or the strong one, the peacekeeper, the successful one. Maybe you became the one who never needed anything and always kept everyone else together. Or maybe you became the one who made everyone proud because somewhere along the way, you learned that pride became connected to love and acceptance. Or maybe you learned how to become whatever the room needed, whatever that room needed you to be, because somewhere inside of that adaptation was safety. And after enough years of being that person, you stop seeing it as something you learned to do. You started believing it was simply who you were. I mean, after all, it is who you became. But but what if it wasn't? Have you ever stopped to consider that? What if somewhere underneath all of those roles, expectations, responsibilities, beliefs, and definitions that you inherited, there's a version of you that has been trying to get your attention your entire life? I don't mean a new you or a better you. I'm not talking about another identity for you to perform. I'm talking about just you as a whole person. And maybe the reason this question feels so incredibly uncomfortable is because if we begin asking what was never ours, we may also have to ask what remains when we finally put it down. So today we're going to talk about those borrowed identities. And honestly, this is where it gets a little complicated because when something has been with you long enough, it becomes really difficult to separate what you learn to do from who you believe yourself to be. I mean, the peacekeeper doesn't necessarily think, I learned how to manage the emotional temperature of the room because somewhere along the way, keeping everyone else calm helped me feel safe. That's not what you hear them say. Usually they'll say something like, I don't like conflict. Or the responsible one doesn't necessarily think, oh, I learned that being dependable was how I earned trust or approval or belonging. What you hear them say are things like, well, that's just who I am. I'm the one people can count on. And what about the person who never asked for help? They don't necessarily recognize that somewhere along the way, needing something may have felt unsafe or disappointing or weak or like too much to ask for. They just simply and quietly declare, I'm independent. And what about the person who can walk into almost any room and become exactly what that room needs? They probably don't recognize that as an adaptation at all. Instead, they might call it emotional intelligence. They might identify it as leadership or strength or capability. And it may be all of those things. It certainly can be. Because we know that two things can be true at the same time. But maybe it didn't start there. You see, maybe some of the things we now celebrate about ourselves began as ways of navigating the world around us, ways of belonging, of staying connected, of keeping the peace, ways of being loved or being safe. And I want to be careful here because I'm not suggesting that every strength is secretly a wound or that every part of who you are needs to be picked apart and analyzed until nothing feels real anymore. That is not the point of any of this at all. The question is not whether the thing itself is good or bad. The question is whether you are still choosing it. You see, there's a difference between being responsible because responsibility is one of your values and being unable to put anything down because your identity depends on being the one who carries it all the time. There's a very distinct difference between being strong and believing you are never allowed to need support. And there is a very big difference between being a peacemaker and abandoning yourself to keep everyone else comfortable. There's also a really, really big difference between being adaptable and becoming so skilled at reading everyone else that you no longer know what you need. But I also know there's a difference between leading from who you are and performing an identity that you have learned so well that even you forgot it was a performance. That is how borrowed identities become so difficult to see. They don't always feel foreign. Most of the time, they feel pretty familiar. They feel like our personality or our values, our strength. They feel like the second skin of the person we have always been. Because at some point, you stop saying, "This is what I learned to do." And you started telling the world, "This is who I am. This is who I've chosen to be. This is who I believe myself to be." And maybe that is one of the first places we have to become willing to get curious. I'm not suggesting that we reject everything about ourselves. And I'm definitely not suggesting that we blame everyone who ever shaped us. But I am suggesting that we ask the question, is this who I am? Am I who I really am? Or am I being who I learned that I needed to be? And then at some point, something begins to shift. Maybe it happens slowly at first. As in fact, maybe you can't even explain it at all at first. But you start noticing that the life you are living doesn't quite fit you anymore. The things you once accepted without question start bothering you. The roles you have always played begin to feel so much heavier. The definitions of success you spent years pursuing don't feel as satisfying as you thought they would. The way you lead, the way you work, the way you show up in relationships, even the way you see yourself starts to feel slightly out of alignment. And somewhere inside of you, something begins saying, "This isn't me. This isn't what I want. This isn't how I want to live or how I want to lead. This is not how I want to love. This isn't how I want to define success anymore." And you might think that that should feel freeing, right? Coming to these realizations. You would think that realizing that something no longer fits would create this beautiful sense of liberation. But oftentimes, it feels more like betrayal. Because the moment you begin stepping outside of the identity you have always lived inside of, you aren't the only one who feels the change. Other people feel it too. The people who have known you as the strong one may not know what to do when you start saying that you need support, when you start speaking up for yourself and asking for what you need. The people who have known you as the responsible one may become uncomfortable when you stop carrying what was never yours and they have to accept more responsibility themselves. The people who have known you as the peacekeeper may call you difficult when you finally stop sacrificing yourself to keep everyone else comfortable because for the first time, you are choosing yourself too. And the people who have always been able to depend on you, being a certain version of yourself, may experience your growth as disruption. And I want you to understand it isn't always because these people don't love you or because they want to keep you small. Sometimes it's simply because your identity has become a part of their sense of stability too. And that is where this gets really uncomfortable because we don't live in isolation. Our identities exist inside of our relationships, our families, our workplaces, our businesses, our communities, our cultures, and entire ecosystems. People learn us. They learn what we will carry and what we will tolerate. They learn what we will fix and what we will forgive. They learn what we will do to make things easier. And they also learn what we will never ask for. Without anyone consciously deciding it, entire relationships and systems can begin organizing themselves around the person you learn to be. So when you change that, the system feels it because suddenly your internal operating system is no longer willing to support the external system in the same way. When you stop carrying something or someone else has to carry its own weight. When you stop keeping the peace, something that has been avoided may finally have to be addressed. And when you stop being everything everyone else needs, other people may have to become more of who they are. Think about how unsettling that can be. Because suddenly, becoming more fully yourself doesn't just feel like personal growth. It feels like you're changing the rules. And in some ways, you are. The more you step outside of a container that may have been designed for you long before you knew you were living inside of it, the more the people and the systems around you may also be required to adjust. When you are no longer available to play the role everyone has grown accustomed to, other people may find themselves facing questions of their own. Like, well, what am I responsible for then? What have I expected someone else to carry? Who am I if this person is no longer willing to be who I have always known them to be? And maybe eventually they find themselves standing in front of the same mirror, asking some of the same questions you have already begun to ask. But the difficult part is that the old container is still so familiar. Even when it feels too small or when it feels too heavy, even when you know that you have outgrown it, there is still something strangely safe about knowing exactly who you are supposed to be. Because familiarity has a way of feeling like safety, even when what is familiar no longer serves us. The moment that you step outside of that container, you might disappoint someone. Heck, in fact, you might even disappoint yourself. You will likely be misunderstood. You will likely be questioned. You may no longer receive the same approval because you are no longer the same version of yourself that everyone, including you, has learned how to live with. Perhaps what is most unsettling is that you may not immediately know who you are without all of it. So you may choose to stay. You may shrink yourself back into that familiar container. You might even pick the backpack back up, even though it feels heavy with everything you have longed to let go of. You might put the armor back on, even though you know what it cost you to keep wearing it. And it's not because the old identity is true, but because sometimes being who everyone expects you to be feels safer than becoming someone even you have not fully met yet. You would think that after carrying something so heavy for so long, putting it down would feel like immediate relief, like freedom, like finally being able to stand up straight, take a full breath in, and move through the world without the weight of everything you were never meant to carry. But when you have carried something long enough, you learn how to live underneath its weight. You adjust to it. You build strength around it. You organize your life around it. And somewhere along the way, you may even stop recognizing that the weight is something you are carrying because you have started believing that it is just a part of your being, of who you are. So, when you finally begin putting the backpack down, something strange can happen. You can put it down and still feel the weight of it on your back. Because physically putting something down and internally releasing yourself from the responsibility of carrying it, not always the same thing. In fact, you can stop doing the thing and still feel responsible for what happens next. You can set the boundaries and still feel the guilt. You can delegate the work and still mentally carry every decision. You can leave the role and still feel responsible for holding everyone together. You can even stop performing the identity and still have an internal operating system that is bracing under its weight. Because invisible survival strategies do not necessarily disappear the moment the visible behavior changes. Sometimes the backpack is already on the ground, but something inside of you is still carrying it. You're still anticipating what might happen if you don't pick it back up. Preparing for someone to be disappointed or waiting for something to fall apart. You're still questioning whether you are actually allowed to leave it there. And that's why the weightlessness doesn't always feel like freedom, at least not at first. Sometimes it feels like confusion or grief. Maybe it feels like standing in the middle of your own life and realizing you don't actually know who you are without the things you have always carried. Because if you are no longer the strong one, then who are you when you need help? If you are no longer the responsible one who carries everything, then who are you when something gets dropped? And if you are no longer the peacekeeper, then who are you when someone is upset with you? And what if you are no longer the person who can become whatever the room needs? What happens when you walk into the room and simply remain yourself? I know those questions can feel terrifying, almost keeping you frozen in the moment. They can steal your breath because we are not just putting down behaviors. We are putting down evidence that we have used time and time again to prove who we are. And that is why this doesn't stay contained to our personal lives. It can't, because we bring these identities with us everywhere. We wear them as the armor we have always used to protect us. They have become the proof of our mere existence. So we bring them into our marriages and our relationships. We bring them into our parenting and into our businesses. We bring them into the boardroom, the team meetings, the difficult conversations, the decisions we have been avoiding, and every room we are responsible for leading. I want you to recognize that the child who learned to keep the peace may become the leader who struggles to have the conversation that needs to be had. The child who learned that being valuable meant being needed may become the executive who delegates the task but keeps every important decision. The child who learned to be responsible for everything and everyone may become the business owner who cannot understand why the entire organization still depends on them. The person who learned to read the room before they ever learned to read themselves might become an incredibly perceptive leader who can sense what everyone else needs while having absolutely no idea what they believe. And again, we know that two things can be true at the same time. These adaptations may have made you extraordinarily capable. They may have helped you become successful. They may even be part of the reason you can lead under pressure, anticipate problems, understand people, carry complexity, and walk into difficult situations without falling apart. But capability does not automatically mean alignment. Success may feel good, but it does not prove that the identity underneath it actually belongs to you. That may be one of the most difficult things for a successful person to consider. Success does not prove that the identity underneath is yours to carry. And maybe that is the revelation hiding underneath all of this. Some of the things we have spent our entire lives calling who we are may actually be who we learned we had to become. Because what happens when the very thing that helped you succeed is also the very thing you are beginning to outgrow? What happens when the identity everyone celebrates is actually the identity you are so exhausted from carrying and maintaining? What happens when people call you a strong leader because of the very pattern that is quietly keeping you from leading as yourself? This is why leadership is never only about what we do, but about who we are. Because leadership is an external expression of an internal operating system that is always working behind the scenes. And if that internal operating system is still organized around an identity that you inherited, then that identity doesn't stay hidden inside of you. It leads with you. In fact, it may enter the room before you ever say a word, because the identities we carry have an energy to them. The person bracing under the weight of being responsible for everything brings that weight into the room with them. The peacekeeper may already be scanning for tension before the difficult conversation has even begun. The leader who learned to become whatever the room needs may already be adjusting themselves before they have even considered what they actually think, feel, or believe. And someone who is constantly maintaining an identity that no longer belongs to them may be carrying the tension of that performance everywhere they go. People may not have language for what they feel. You may not even have language for it yourself, but it's there. It is in the tension you carry into the room. It's in what you anticipate before anything has happened. It's in the way you brace before you speak. It's in the space between what you actually believe and what you think the room needs you to say. Because borrowed identities often require performance to maintain them. You have to keep being the strong one, the responsible one, the capable one, the one who has it all together, the one who doesn't need anything, the one who keeps the peace. And the longer you perform that identity, the more the armor becomes part of how you enter the room. So, yes, the identity influences what you are willing to say and what you avoid saying. It shapes what you carry, what you control, what you delegate, and what you refuse to let go of. It influences how you respond when pressure rises, how you hold authority, how you make decisions, and eventually how the people around you learn to operate. But it also shapes your presence. Because there is a difference between entering a room while carrying the weight of who you believe you have to be and entering that same room as yourself. One is performance, the other is presence. And perhaps that is part of what begins to change as we finally release the weight. Instead of simply putting the backpack down, the armor begins to loosen. The performance begins to become less necessary. And the energy we once used to maintain an identity that was never ours becomes available for something else. Becomes available for presence, for discernment, for truth. Becomes available for actually being in the room instead of constantly managing who we need to be inside of it. So you may think you are simply leading, but somewhere underneath it all, you may still be fulfilling an assignment you were given a very, very long time ago. And that is where this question becomes much bigger than simply, who are you? Because it also becomes, who is leading your life? Who is leading your business? Who is leading your team? And the even bigger question is it you? Or is it the person you learned you had to become? And maybe after asking all of those questions, you are sitting here thinking, okay, but if all of that isn't me, then who the heck am I? And I wish I could give you a simple answer. I wish I could tell you that the moment you recognize a borrowed identity, you put it down, walk away, and suddenly everything becomes clear. But I don't think that's how it works. Because how do you know what is actually yours when the messaging began before you ever had language for yourself? How do you separate who you are from who you became in response to everyone and everything around you when those things have been woven together for most of your life? I mean, how do you know which values are yours? Which beliefs are yours? Which dreams are yours? Which definitions of success, of love, of leadership, responsibility, of strength, of faith, and even purpose actually belong to you? I think this is why discovering who we are is such a lifelong journey, because we are constantly uncovering another layer, another definition we assumed was true, maybe even another expectation we have been trying to satisfy. Or maybe it's another rock in that invisible backpack that we suddenly realize we've been carrying for years without ever asking how the heck it got there. And sometimes the first step in discovering who you are is being willing to admit that you don't really know. And I know that can feel terrifying. For some of you, it may almost feel impossible to wrap your mind around. You see, we spend so much of our lives trying to become certain about ourselves. We want the labels, the answers, the clear definitions. We want to be able to say, this is who I am, and believe that that sentence is finished. But maybe it's not supposed to be finished. Maybe part of being human is continuing to discover who we are as we grow and stretch and change and become capable of seeing things we could not see before. And maybe not knowing who you are for a while is not the crisis we think it is, although it will likely feel monumental. But maybe it's space. Space that has never been available before because it was already filled with everyone else's expectations. Maybe it's space to question, to listen, to discover what actually matters to you so that you can decide what you believe. Maybe it's space to notice what feels true when you are no longer trying to make it acceptable to everyone else. And maybe, although that space can be incredibly uncomfortable, it is exactly what we need. Because we are so accustomed to filling uncertainty as quickly as possible. We are uncomfortable with the silence, uncomfortable with the stillness. We are uncomfortable with not knowing. So we become accustomed to putting down one identity and immediately reaching for another. We trade one label for a better label, one definition for a more evolved definition, maybe even one version of performance for another version that looks more authentic, because that feels more comfortable. That's more recognizable. It feels more familiar than the silence, and it feels more familiar than the space. But what if the silence is where we begin to hear what we could not hear before? What if the stillness allows us to see what we could not see while we were so busy maintaining who we thought we had to be? What if the space is not something we need to fill? What if it needs room to actually breathe? Because if we do not allow ourselves to sit in that space, to sit in the silence, in the discomfort of the unknown, before we know it, we may have built another container, maybe a bigger one, maybe a prettier one, maybe even one we realize that we believe we chose more consciously. But it is still a container. Doesn't matter, it's still a container. Because the work is not to rush into deciding who you are. There's no hurry. The work is to become willing to meet yourself in that space, in the silence, in that gap, in that uncomfortable moment, to notice what remains when you are not managing the room, when you are not working so hard to prove your value or prove who you are, when you are not being needed, when you are not desperately trying to keep the peace, or when you are not trying to become who someone else needs you to be. Who are you then? What do you believe when no one is asking you to defend it? What do you want when no one else gets a vote? What matters to you when success is no longer defined by what everyone else can see? And most importantly, what becomes possible when you stop asking, who am I supposed to be? And instead you begin asking, what is true for me right now? Because maybe discovering who you are is not one grand revelation. Perhaps it happens one piece at a time. One rock out of that backpack, one belief questioned, one expectation released, one moment where you choose differently for yourself. Maybe it's one moment where you hear your own voice and recognize it because you allow the discomfort, the space, and the stillness to exist. And slowly, the space that once felt empty begins to feel expansive. Not because you have finally created the perfect identity. I mean, there is no such thing as the perfect identity. But because for the first time, you are giving yourself room to discover the person who has been underneath all of it all this time. And as you begin discovering what is yours and what may have never been, another question eventually comes with it. What do you do with everything you are finally ready to put down? Right? What do you do with that? Because when we start recognizing the beliefs, the identities, the expectations, and the patterns that we've inherited, it can be really easy to start looking backward. Who gave this to me? Where the heck did this come from? Why did they teach me this? Why did they make me believe this was who I had to be? I understand those questions. Sometimes we need to understand where something came from before we can recognize why we have been carrying it. But understanding where it came from and deciding what happens next are two very different things. And this is where you have to take the reins of your own leadership. Not just leadership in a business, talking about leadership of your life, of your choices, leadership of what you believe, and leadership of what you will continue. The leadership of who you are willing to become. Because at some point, knowing where the backpack came from is not the same as putting it down. Freedom does not require us to find someone to blame before we are allowed to choose something different. There is actually nothing we need to give back to another person. The backpack was never theirs to take back. The armor doesn't need to be returned. You simply get to put it down. Put it down. You get to recognize that the belief no longer serves you, that the pattern is no longer yours to repeat, that the identity may have been given or inherited or assigned or absorbed or simply learned over time. But you are no longer required to keep living from it. And I want you to hear that. I want you to hear me when I say you are no longer required to keep living from it. Because once you can see the pattern, once you can recognize the identity, once you can feel the weight of what you have been carrying, something changes. You have choice. And choice is where leadership begins. Not control, not blame, not pretending the past did not happen, but choice. The willingness to look at what shaped you and decide what gets to shape you now. That does not mean you are responsible for what was handed to you. It doesn't mean that you chose the circumstances that shaped you. It doesn't mean that everything you ever experienced was okay. And it certainly does not mean that harm should be minimized, excused, or renamed as love simply because someone was doing the best they knew how. That's not what I'm suggesting at all. I'm not minimizing whatever your experiences may have been. But there is a difference between responsibility and blame. And there's also a difference between taking responsibility for your life and taking responsibility for everything and everyone in it. Some of us learn to carry responsibility for everything. Every missed deadline, every bad decision, every conflict, every disappointment, every outcome, every person in the room. And we called that leadership. We called it strength. We called it being dependable. Maybe we called it love. But taking responsibility for your part is not the same as taking responsibility for everything. And refusing to blame someone else does not mean accepting responsibility for what was never yours. That is part of the recalibration too. Knowing what belongs to you and knowing what doesn't. Knowing what you are accountable for and having the courage to allow someone else to carry what belongs to them. Because if your borrowed identity says, I am the responsible one, then even healing can become another place where you pick up everyone else's backpack. You start understanding everyone, excusing everyone, making room for everyone, giving grace to everyone. And somehow, once again, you disappear from the equation. You disappear from it. That is not grace. That is the old identity finding a new costume. And we do this everywhere. All of us, we do this everywhere. We do it in our families when we keep solving problems that other people need to learn how to solve for themselves. We do it in our relationships when we call it love, but continue abandoning ourselves to keep someone else comfortable. We do it in our parenting when our own fears become the very ceiling we unknowingly place over our children. We do it in leadership when we call it support while quietly taking over someone else's responsibility. We call it mentorship while never allowing someone to struggle long enough to develop their own judgment. We call it protecting the team while absorbing every difficult conversation ourselves. We call it accountability while privately believing every outcome is still ours to control. You see, the language changes, the identity doesn't. And if we are not willing to see that, we can spend our entire lives changing the circumstances while continuing the same pattern. Think about it. Different relationship, but same identity. Different job, same identity. Maybe different title, same identity. Different language, same identity. And that is where the fire has to come in. It is where the fire has to come in and show up. And it's not the fire that burns everything down. It is the fire that illuminates. The fire that lets you finally see what has been operating in the dark. It's the fire that gives you enough courage to say, I understand where this came from, and I am still choosing differently. Because you can have compassion for the people who came before you without continuing what they carried. You can understand why someone became who they became without allowing their fears to become the architecture of your life. You can love someone and refuse to keep living inside the identity that they needed you to be, not who you are. You can honor where you came from without handing it the authority to determine where you go. That's leadership too. In fact, maybe some of the deepest leadership of your life. Because leadership is not only about taking people somewhere. Sometimes leadership is having the courage to stop taking yourself back to the same place. And that takes grace. Grace for the person who carried what they did not yet know they were allowed to put down. Grace for the version of you who became whatever they needed to become to make it through. Grace for the leader in you who is beginning to recognize that some of what you called strength, responsibility, love, or leadership may have been an old identity doing exactly what it learned to do. Grace for moments when you pick the backpack back up because the weight still feels more familiar than the freedom. And perhaps even grace for the people who handed some of it to you. Because what if they were carrying backpacks too? What if they gave you what had been given to them? What if they taught you what they had been taught? So what if some of the things they passed down as truth were simply things that no one had ever given them permission to question? Now, that doesn't erase impact. It doesn't require reconciliation. It doesn't mean access. It also does not mean pretending that something did not hurt. Grace does not require you to abandon yourself in order to understand someone else. Grace doesn't ask you to put the armor back on. And grace doesn't require you to keep carrying the pattern so that someone else never has to confront it. Maybe grace simply allows us to see the human being, to see them, and to see ourselves. Maybe grace simply allows us to recognize that maybe they did the best they could with what they had. And to recognize that we are still allowed to choose differently with what we have now. Both can be true. You can honor where you came from and still choose not to live there. I know. You can love someone and refuse to continue their pattern. It's true. You can understand why someone became who they became and still decide that who they needed you to be is not who you are. You can deeply care about the people in your life and still allow them to carry what belongs to them. You can be compassionate without becoming responsible for everyone. You can be accountable without making yourself the source of every outcome. You can be grateful for what was given to you and put down what was never yours to carry. And maybe grace is the doorway that allows us to do that. Not grace as an excuse, not grace as another way to silence ourselves, but grace asks us not to pretend everything is fine, but grace under fire. The kind of grace that can stand in the heat of becoming more fully yourself without needing to burn down everyone who knew you before. Now that's grace. Because maybe the person who handed you the backpack never knew they could put theirs down. I mean, maybe no one ever showed them that they could. And maybe one of the most powerful things you can do as a human being, as a parent, as a partner, as a leader, is not carry it forward. Not because you hate where you came from, and not because you need someone else to be wrong in order for you to become right, but because you have decided that what was inherited does not have to become what is continued. Not in your life, not in your relationships, not in your leadership, not in the cultures that you create, not in the people who will come after you. You can let the pattern end without ending the love. You can put the backpack down without throwing it at the person who gave it to you. You can choose yourself without making someone else the enemy. And maybe that is what it means to lead yourself through the fire. Not to emerge untouched by what shaped you, but to stop allowing what shaped you to be the only thing that gets to define you. And this is where faith enters the conversation in a way that it could not have entered before. Because after all of this, after questioning what was yours, recognizing what may have been borrowed, putting down the backpack, sitting in the silence, taking the reins of your own leadership, and extending grace to yourself and the people who shaped you, you may still be left with one question. Who am I? And maybe the answer is not that you need to invent someone new, because you don't need another identity. You don't need another label. You don't need to build a better version of yourself to replace the one you just put down, because this was never about becoming someone else at all. It has always been about returning, remembering who you are, returning to the person God knew before the world started telling you who to be. And I know that even the word remembering can feel kind of difficult here, because how do you remember someone you may feel like you have never actually known? How do you return to a version of yourself you can't clearly see? How do you recognize what is true when so much of what you have believed has been filtered through the expectations, the fears, the experiences, and the limitations of everyone and everything around you? But maybe it's not about remembering all at once. It's not about a full remembrance in one moment. Remembering happens the same way we have talked about putting the backpack down. It happens one moment, one breath, one piece at a time. One belief that no longer feels true. One expectation you are finally willing to release. One moment where you hear your own voice underneath all that noise. One decision that feels more aligned than the one you would have made before. It's likely one moment of stillness where you stop asking the world who you are supposed to be, and you become quiet enough to listen for something deeper. Because faith gives us somewhere to go when we have reached the edge of what we know about ourselves. Faith gives us something greater than our own history to lean into, something greater than the messages we've inherited. It is something greater than the fears that were passed down, greater than the identities that we learn to perform, greater even than our own limited understanding of who we think we are allowed to become. And for me, that is where God enters this process. I mean, he's been right beside us this entire time. All along, he's been right there. It's not another voice telling you who you have to be. And it's not another identity you have to perform correctly. And it's not another standard you have to exhaust yourself trying to live up to. But it is a place of return, a place where underneath everything the world has added, has shaped, has assigned, has expected, has demanded, underneath all of that, there is something in you that has never actually been lost. Covered up, maybe. Lost? No. Buried underneath the rocks in that backpack, protected by the armor that we constantly throw up, hidden beneath years of performance. Yes. But lost? No. And maybe that is why some parts of this journey feel less like becoming and more like recognition. There are moments when something feels true before you can explain why. There are moments when you make a choice and something inside of you becomes quieter. moments when you stop performing and instead of everything falling apart, you feel yourself become more present. There are moments when you look in the mirror and maybe for the first time in a very, very long time, you begin to recognize the person looking back at you. Not because that person is perfect, because there's no such thing. And it's not because you've figured it all out or because the work is finished, because again, never happens. But because there is less between you and yourself. There is less armor. There is less performance. There is less weight. There is less of everyone else's voice drowning out your own. And maybe that is what coming home begins to feel like. It is a becoming. It's not some grand arrival or some final version of you. It's not even an identity carved in stone that you now have to spend the rest of your life maintaining. But it is a deeper relationship with yourself. A deeper relationship with your soul, with your faith, with God. A willingness to keep listening, to keep questioning, to keep releasing, to keep choosing you. And to trust that you do not have to know the entire person you are becoming in order to take the next step as the person you are right now. Because maybe the goal was never to finally arrive at one perfect answer to the question, who am I? Maybe the deeper invitation is to become so rooted in your faith, so connected to your own soul, and so willing to remain present with yourself that you no longer need the world to answer that question for you. And maybe that is where your frequency begins to change too. Because frequency is not something that we manufacture. Frequency is not something that we perform. And it's not about trying to become more positive or more magnetic or more enlightened or more of anything, actually. Your frequency is the energy of who we are being. And when so much of your energy has been used to maintain an identity that was never truly yours, there's a tension inside of that. There's distance between who you are and who you believe you have to be, between what you know and what you say, between what you feel and what you allow yourself to express, between the person underneath the armor and the person you keep sending into the world. And people may not have language for that distance yet, but they can often feel it. You can feel it. It is the exhaustion of constantly managing yourself, the bracing, the performing, the monitoring, the adjusting. The weight of trying to hold an identity together that your soul may have already begun to outgrow. But as the backpack gets lighter, as the armor begins to loosen and drop off, as the performance becomes less necessary, something shifts. You see, there is less distance between your internal world and your external expression. There's less energy being spent maintaining who you thought you had to be. And more of that energy becomes available for your presence, for your connection, for your discernment, for your truth. Yeah. For the actual experience of being alive inside your own light. Maybe that is what changes your frequency. Not becoming someone new, not forcing yourself into some higher version of who you think you should be, but becoming more coherent with who you already are. Your faith becomes something you live from instead of something you reach for only when you're lost. Your fire becomes something that illuminates instead of something you use to prove, protect, or perform. And your frequency becomes the expression of a life with less distance between your soul and the person you allow the world to meet. Maybe that is why coming home feels so different. Because you are no longer using so much of your energy trying to leave yourself. That changes how you lead. Because you are no longer using leadership to prove who you are. You can actually be present with the people you are leading. When you are no longer asking the room to validate your identity, you can listen differently. You can make decisions differently. You hold authority differently. You, my friend, will love differently, will parent differently, will partner differently. In fact, you will build your life differently because you can lead your own life differently. Not because you've become fearless all of a sudden. In fact, just the opposite. It is because you've embraced your fear. Not because you will never pick the backpack back up, because let me tell you, we all know that you'll be tempted to do that on more than one occasion. We all will. And it is not because the old identity will never come knocking when pressure rises, because we know that, in fact, that is where it will rear its ugly head the most, when the pressure's on. But because you now recognize it, and the recognition changes what's possible, you can feel the weight and ask whether or not it is yours. You can notice the armor tightening around you and ask, what are you trying to protect? You can feel yourself slipping into performance and then ask, what do you believe you need to become in this moment? And then you can choose. You can choose again and again and again. You can choose. Because maybe becoming who you were always meant, just maybe becoming who you were always meant to be is not just one decision. It is a lifetime of choosing not to abandon yourself, a lifetime of allowing what was never yours to fall away, a lifetime of extending grace to the person you have been while making room for the person you are still discovering. In fact, maybe it's a lifetime of trusting that the God who knew you before the world had an opinion about you has not forgotten who you are, even in the moments when you have. So maybe the question isn't, who do I need to become now? Maybe the question is, what am I finally ready to put down so I can hear who I have been underneath it all? What borrowed identity am I still performing because I'm afraid of who I might be without it? And what might become possible if I trusted that putting it down is not losing myself? Maybe this is finally how I begin to come home. Because you were never meant to spend your entire life carrying the weight of who everyone else needed you to be. You were never meant to confuse the armor with your identity. You were never meant to perform your way into worthiness. And you were never meant to hand the leadership of your life to every voice that came before your own. I want you to remember that you get to choose, that you get to listen, that you get to question. I want you to remember that you get to release, and that you get to remember who you are in every breath, in every moment of every day. And maybe underneath everything you have carried, everything you have performed, and everything you have been told you had to be, there is still a version of you waiting to be recognized. Not a new you, not a better you, just you. And maybe it's time to come home.
Leadership isn't what you perform, it's what you embody. If this conversation resonated, share it with someone ready to lead differently. And remember, when your faith ignites your fire amplifies your frequency. Until next time.